Welcome to Pacific Mammal Research's Marine Mammal Highlight Series. We are a 501c3 research and education nonprofit studying marine mammals in the Salish Sea off Washington State. In this series, you will learn about different marine mammals as we discuss interesting facts about each species. This is our way to geek out, share some information, and have some fun. We hope you enjoy the series, and be sure to follow us on Instagram to vote for which animal we talk about next. And without further ado,
welcome to the PacMam podcast. I'm Cindy.
I'm Kat.
I'm Trevor.
And this week is a marine mammal highlight. And we went for some lesser known species this time to see which ones you guys wanted us to do. And the Tucuxi, right? That's how it's said, right? It's Tucuxi. So it's really kind of interesting name, and Kat's going to talk about where that came from. But it's we are actually doing two for the price of one because the Tucuxi and the Giana dolphin are both species of Sotalia, which is the genus name, and they're really similar. They just live in slightly different areas and look a little bit different, but they have a lot of the same behaviors, and they're basically at one point were just two different ecotypes of the species. But recently they just discovered that there was enough differences that they are actually different species. So because they are so similar, we're just going to put them all together. So we're doing the Sotalia species.
Kind of like the finless porpoises that we did.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so when they're that similar, we'd just be repeating ourselves in the next podcast. So there's no need to do that. So we're going to be talking about, just a brief, the two different ones, the Tucuxi and the Giana. The Tucuxi are basically mostly in rivers, and the Giana are in the marine or coastal area. And Trevor will talk more about that, but that's the main difference between the two, is where they live. So I'll let Trevor tell you more.
So imagine your most classic dolphin, the bottlenose dolphin, but smaller. That's what these two species are essentially. The Tucuxi can grow up to 4.9 feet, which is not big at all.
That's smaller than a harbor porpoise.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so crazy.
4.9 feet and up to 121 pounds.
That's when I saw that, I was like, 100 pounds. Like, that's nothing.
It's tiny.
Tiny.
And if you look at the comparison pictures with people and the dolphin, it's just so small.
Which is strange because bottlenose dolphins can be quite big. So it's just like, it's a mini-me. It's a mini-me.
And I looked at pictures of them, like, because they're so scarce, right? Or not documented well, I guess.
Yes.
And they look like porpoise when they're surfacing.
They seem they're really quick at the surface.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But those guys, the river-based ones, the Tucuxis, are up to that weight, but the Giana are up to 7.2 feet long and 176 pounds. So still not big, but
that's
bigger.
Quite a big difference.
Yeah. So again, they were the same species at one point, but just different genetics are leading to sizes and little nitty-gritty things.
But that's interesting because like bottlenose dolphins have different ecotypes, and the size is a big difference between like the oceanic ones and the coastal ones, and they're still the same species, but it's interesting that they kind of have a similar thing going on there.
Same thing here with bigs, and the resident killer whales are technically the same species, but bigs are slightly bigger.
Right. Interesting.
But yeah, so range-wise, you can find the Tucuxi in the Amazon River and all of its tributaries, essentially. And it can go pretty far up the river, like Colombia and Ecuador and Peru, I think it's all been documented in. Whereas the Giana is near the coast, pretty much all of the northeastern South America. So as far south as Brazil and as far north as Nicaragua. They've been documented, and there's been a possible report in Honduras as well.
Oh, interesting.
So that's
is that a more recent one?
I think within the last 10 years, yeah, it's unconfirmed.
Okay. Interesting.
But they have been seen in the rivers too. It's just more common in the coastal area. And
I saw that they could go up the rivers a fair amount, but whether they do or not.
Yeah, I think they found one 80 miles up a river. I can't remember which river that was, but it was not the Amazon.
There's many rivers down there.
Yeah, there's a lot. But they did see it up there. So they basically brackish water, I guess. And salt, obviously. But the farthest they've been seen off the coast is off an archipelago off Brazil, 70 miles or 70 kilometers offshore.
Okay. That's a fair amount offshore. Yeah.
But I mentioned they look like mini bottlenose essentially, but they're gray to little bluish in coloration with white going along the flanks. And they tend to have a lighter, even pinkish backside.
Yeah, well, the ventral, yeah, like the stomach
Sorry,
area.
ventral,
Yeah, no, I saw the
Yeah.
pictures and I was like, because sometimes bottlenose dolphins, you'll see they'll get flushed if they're, you know, blood vessels and stuff, and they'll get a little bit of a tinge of it, but they're pretty pink in
Right.
comparison to others.
And the Giana, if you really want to find a difference between the two in coloration, they tend to have more white streaks on their peduncle on either side compared to the Tucuxi. And I mentioned they kind of look like porpoise. They have a pretty triangular fin as well, but sometimes a little hooked at the top, but it's pretty triangular for a dolphin.
Yeah, I thought that was funny too. I was like, I have a couple things in the behavior that they're similar to porpoises too, so it's kind of interesting.
Right.
Interesting. Huh.
And there's not a ton of information on these guys. I'm trying to find little differences here and there between the two species. And what I could find was the Tucuxi has 26 to 36 teeth. And all I could find was that the Giana has more. Not
Like,
a defined
we haven't
So if
counted
you
them
get a
all, we
look
just
inside their
know.
mouth, like
Right.
if they open their mouth at you, just make sure you count real fast. And if there's more than that number,
Then,
it might
you
be
know.
a Giana.
And we don't really
No
know the actual
pressure.
populations, but we know that they're fairly abundant and where they are found. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
it seems like the general theme in South America is we just don't know populations of cetaceans.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the status section as well.
Okay. But yeah, the main difference is a little bit the appearance, but the ranges are a lot different.
Yeah.
But the freshwater guys, the Tucuxi, they can be found in lakes, they can be found in the rivers, but just a quick thing, they will not go into flooded forests like a classic river dolphin might, but I'm sure Cindy will talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, because just to put this in perspective too, the Tucuxi live in the same area as the pink Amazon river dolphin, so they kind of share that area. But the like Trevor was saying, the Amazon river dolphin will go into those flooded forests, whereas these guys don't. Which, I mean, may just because it's a little bit more dangerous to do that if you're not good
Right.
about when the water level is going away.
I think it's interesting though that the Amazon river dolphins will, even though they're quite a bit larger than these guys. You'd almost think that the smaller species would be more inclined to do it because they might be a little bit more maneuverable or could handle those lower water levels. So that's just intriguing.
Yeah, it's possible. Well, what's interesting too is I did find some information about their vision. So they can see pretty well, but they have better processing power than the Amazon river dolphin, but their clarity is not as good because they are basically marine. So they're marine, but they can go in the freshwater. So the ability to see through that isn't as good as the Amazon river dolphin. So maybe that's part of it too. They can just see better the stuff that's around them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
With that information, I'll leave my last fact with them having one of the largest brain sizes per body size in any mammal. Not the largest, but it's
pretty high.
Top,
I know
top 1%.
Because I mean, bottlenose dolphins have one of the largest brain to body size ratios.
Exactly, they're just so similar to bottlenose, but they're smart.
Well, so they just shrunk. So they shrunk the bodies, but didn't quite shrink as much the brain.
Right.
So there's interesting, very cool.
And those river guys too, they're little dependent on the area too, because there's a lot of big waterfalls in the Amazon, right? They can't go up those waterfalls, so that's where their ranges kind of end. Or very
yeah, they don't like fast moving water, which is also interesting.
I wonder if it has to do with currents at all, you know, evolutionary wise, it's staying away from currents and just, I don't know, that's just a thought.
Yeah, well, I mean, they are smaller, so maybe it is just harder for them to get through. They don't have as much power, I don't know, to be able to deal with the fast water. I don't know. Interesting. Well, I have a fun fact that I actually got to see a Tucuxi. And
did you really?
Amazon river. I did. So we went to Brazil, and we got to go up the Amazon. Yeah. And so I was like, I went for a music thing. I play the clarinets on my other side of my life. And we were doing some concerts down there. And so we got to go up the Amazon River, and I was like, I need to see a pink Amazon river dolphin. And then we ended up getting to see both of them. So they were both in the same area. It was super cool.
That's really cool.
Yeah. I sadly, I kind of forgot about it. I mean, like, oh, I saw the pink Amazon river dolphin. I'm like, oh, I also saw a Tucuxi. because I was so excited.
See,
about
it's like people get so excited about seeing orcas and then forget that they saw harbor porpoise.
Exactly.
Same thing.
I know. I felt so bad. I was like, oh man, I can't believe I forgot them, but it was really cool. So as it was kind of a bucket list thing I got to do, which is really awesome. But I didn't get to really realize the size. We were kind of on the boat that we were on was a little bit bigger, so it was harder to really see that they were so tiny in comparison. I was just so excited I got to see them. So I will go ahead and move into the behavior. And so as Trevor alluded to, we don't know a whole lot about these guys because there's just not as much research. And I think like porpoises, they're a little bit hard because they surface really quickly. They're really small. And in some, especially with the river dolphin part, it's harder to maneuver in there sometimes. So I'll tell you what I know, what I found out. But they basically, the two species are very similar. There's some slight differences. So I'm going to kind of do a general and then I'll tell you where they differ. They're generally in smaller groups from like 1 to 6, but can be found in larger groups up to 20, the Tucuxi, and up to 50 or 60 in the Giana. And that makes sense simply because of the restriction of being in a river versus being on the coast.
You're not going to find hundreds of them together in a river.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's gonna be a little tight. It's a really tight party. And the Guiana dolphins have been seen cooperatively feeding in groups of 100 to 200. So again, very similar to what we see with porpoises, right? Very small groups. Occasionally we'll see them in larger ones. And then sometimes you see these aggregations of 100 or more.
I mean, we saw that huge aggregation last year with the porpoises.
Right. Yeah. Where there was like, 200-300 porpoises all in an area. So, and it's an interesting correlation there. And they do say that in the Guiana dolphins, the 50 to 60 is fairly common. It's not as rare, I think, as it is in porpoises, but you're right. But they are very cohesive and social. So when they're in those groups, they're not just like, maybe we're in a group together. They're in this group and they're doing their thing together. They are really active. They basically they feed and travel a lot. They don't really see them resting and milling much. They're kind of always on the go. Again, maybe because they're like harbor porpoises, they're small, they need to eat. They got to get the energy in. So they're constantly moving around, but they will do full aerial leaps, somersaults, fluke ups, spy hopping, surface rolling, and porpoising, which you may not think like, well, yeah, dolphins do that. But especially for the Tucuxi, that's weird because river dolphins don't do that. Like you don't really see pink Amazon river dolphins leaping out of the water. Like occasionally you might see them, keep their head up and flop over, or, do a little bit out of the water. But so they're the only dolphin species in the river that does that. And I think that's another important distinction to make. I was going to mention earlier is that these guys are in the family Delphinidae, so they are true dolphins, whereas river dolphins are in a different family. So I don't know. I was thinking about this. What are they then? Because technically they're not dolphins.
Right. I mean, I think they are. I mean, certainly when you hear about them, they are considered part of the river dolphin grouping. But that's a really good point. Is genetically they're not listed under. Yeah,
it's family Inidae versus Delphinidae versus whatever. So
that's always been my issue with marine mammals. Like, the Baikal seal is considered a marine mammal and river dolphins are a marine mammal, even though they're not in the marine environment.
Right, yeah. True, right. Yeah. We have some inconsistencies in our taxonomy.
Water-based mammals.
Right? Water-based. Exactly. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting side note. And so they have not been known to bow ride, but the coastal guys, more likely the Giana, will surf the wakes of passing boats along that are out on the coast. And so again, very similar to porpoises, right? Our harbor porpoises here will not bow ride, but they will wake ride, but usually after the boat is gone, right? They don't follow the boat; they just go wee as the wake goes by. So I think that's a very similar behavior there. They did have a documentation of a lone Guiana dolphin that was kind of like the lone bottlenose dolphins that get together with that like human interaction. There was one down, I forgot where it was, but down there in South America, and he or she would swim with dogs in the water. guess he really needed some, I mean, they're very social, right? Again, like bottlenose dolphins. So if he's by
Yeah, I've seen
himself.
plenty of videos of bottlenose dolphins in like Florida playing with.
Oh yeah,
dolphins.
with yeah. There's one that with a cat, isn't there with a cat like from the dock?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
So again, very similar to their larger cousins. And they did see hand feeding of that, I think that dolphin and maybe others in certain areas too, similar to what you see in Florida where people will feed the animals, which by the way, don't do that. It's very,
Right.
very
I'll
bad.
talk about that a little bit too in the threats.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So they are social little guys. They love to just kind of be around everybody. They don't really know what they do, kind of during the day exactly. The group size can vary with time or of day and activity, but this may vary between populations because it's one study would say this and another study says that. So different populations likely have different activity budgets. But there is one thing that's pretty understood is that their vocalizations correlate with group size and behavior. So the behavior and group size influence the whistle variation that they saw. So basically they're saying different things within different contexts. Which is
pretty cool.
Yeah. So they could, see like, oh, well, this behavior is going on. This is the frequency of the whistles. And this is really cool. Their vocalizations are particularly interesting because they have some of the highest pitch whistles of any dolphin. And I didn't realize this, but apparently there's a link between smaller size, the size and pitch. So the smaller the size of the animal, the higher the pitch, which makes sense. But I was like, well, I guess these are like the little mice of the dolphin species. So they have some cool vocalizations. They do have, as far as they know, seem to have very small home ranges, possibly the smallest of any known dolphin species. The Guiana dolphins have been sighted in the same area up to 10 years through some photo ID of certain individuals. And so they don't travel very far. They can occasionally if they want to, but they tend to want to stay where they're at. And as we kind of briefly talked about before, it's likely that their ranges are influenced by the rivers and the changing water levels. So especially in the Amazon River, there's high water times, there's low water times, and so where they can go is going to be limited by those water levels, and to some degree for the coastal guys too, but to a lesser degree. And like we said earlier, the Tucuxi will not go into those flooded forests, and that may be like we talked about, a physical reason why they can't see as well or whatever, but maybe it also may just be habitat partitioning, and prey availability. So if the two Amazon river dolphin and the Tucuxi are living in the same area, you got to split up the resources. So if the Amazon river dolphin can go into those flooded forests and the Tucuxi don't, then that's food that the river dolphins have that they're not competing with. So
I'm really curious what their metabolism is too, if they're so small, and because I know porpoises are pretty high. So
yeah, well, it'd be interesting because here harbor porpoises are very high. I mean, here, but everywhere they are, but they're in really cold water, so that they would have a higher metabolic rate most likely than the ones in the warmer water. But what that difference is, I don't know. So it would be interesting, especially to compare them to bottlenose dolphins.
I'm assuming their echolocation must be pretty good in pretty murky water.
Yeah.
So speaking of echolocation and finding prey, they basically eat many of the same things. They have ray fin fishes, herring, drums, croakers, tetras, which I thought was funny, catfishes, and tetras only because I only think of tetras as aquarium fish, even though I know they live in the wild, but that's, you normally think, you see tetras in your home aquariums. But they'll also eat squid, octopus, sometimes even shrimp, crab, and flounder. And they think that young fish may be an important part of their diet, which I think would make sense because they're so small.
Right. It's just again, like the harbor porpoise eat a lot of the forage fish, the smaller fish species typically.
Yep. You're a smaller animal, you need some smaller things to eat. And they are very quick at the surface, again, like porpoises. They make short dives, 30 seconds to a minute for the Tucuxi and 30 seconds to 2 minutes for the Giana. And they're, they dive, they do these very shallow, quick dives, because they're, especially with Tucuxi, they're not in very deep water in the first place in the rivers compared to the coast. And so where the best fish buffets are in these areas are in confluences, and confluences are basically where two rivers meet. So especially in the Amazon River Basin, it looks like a spider web of rivers and tributaries and stuff. So where those two meet, the pH is favorable for plankton growth, which feeds small fish, which then feed the dolphins. So it's kind of like the with porpoises where the riptides are, the rip currents and stuff, where they can, it's easier for them to catch fish in that area, or there's a reason why the fish are there. So they take advantage of that. And as with other cetacean species, birds are buggers and like to steal their fish. So they basically follow after the dolphins and grab the prey that they are chasing. So in the Guiana dolphins, the brown booby, terns, frigates, and kelp gulls are all known associates. And with the river dolphins, the Tucuxi, they've occasionally seen them with terns. So it's not as common in the rivers as it is along the coast. So again, good for the birds, but not great for the dolphins. And so lastly, that's pretty much what we know about their behavior. Again, we don't know a lot just because of they're just harder to study, I think. But reproductively in their lifespan, they can live up to 35 years, and they become sexually mature around 5 to 6. They don't really know much about their mating behavior, though they think that the Guiana dolphins, when they're traveling, that males may be herding females. So that might be part of their mating strategy. They have a gestation of about 11 to 12 months and have calves every 2 years about. And which is interesting is that in the Guiana dolphins, the calving occurs year round, apparently. But the Tucuxi, because they're more related to the rivers and those water levels, calving occurs in September through November, which coincides with the low water season in the Amazon.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Like less fluctuation probably with the water.
Yeah, possibly. Maybe it's just, yeah, I don't know if it's just safer. They don't really have, I mean, Kat will talk about predators, but there's not really many to worry about there. So I don't know if shallow water would really be helpful in that respect, but maybe it's just easier for the baby dolphins to.
That's what I was wondering, because didn't you publish a paper here showing that calves are less commonly seen in the high rip?
Yeah, so the harbor porpoises in our area in particular, we saw them more during slack tide, because conceivably because the water is easier to swim through. And it's
That's kind of what I'm wondering with these guys then.
Yeah, it could be, absolutely. I mean, they have so many other similarities with porpoises, so makes sense.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah. So my last thing, which is interesting, is that there have been hybrid calves seen between bottlenose dolphins and Tucuxi. Yeah. And the mixed species groups that they see are often social, but in the Guiana dolphins, they have seen mating behavior with bottlenose dolphins, but usually the interactions are aggressive, and with the bottlenose dolphins obviously being the aggressor, because they almost always are, unfortunately, and the Guiana dolphins fleeing from them. So there's some interesting interactions between bottlenose dolphins and their little mini-me's.
So was that pre-separation species of the species that the hybrids were found?
No, that's recently. Like, I mean, recently by most of the papers that I found were older, but the more recent ones were like 2008, 2009.
So the bottlenose must go up the river a little bit then.
Yeah, well, I think the Tucuxi can also, if they're down by the mouth of the river, then the bottlenose can pop in there.
To the river to brackish. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. So I think they just kind of interact with each other every once in a while. So I think that is what I have for behavior. So I think with that, we will take a break before we get into the bad stuff and then the fun facts.
Let's do it.
Cat has. We'll be right back. And we're back, and Kat is going to lead us into the threats and then fun facts of the Tucuxi and Giana.
Yeah, I like that I always get the depressing part.
But then you get to lift us up. So
that's true. That's true. Just take you on the roller coaster. So let's talk about status first. As Trevor already mentioned, the actual population count for either of these species is still unknown. The general consensus is that across its range, they both do seem to be fairly common. Although I did see a couple of things that mentioned that the Tucuxi might be on a slight decline of population, but again, I couldn't find anything to sort of substantiate that or figure out how they were estimating that. So
I think it would have to be between different populations too. I'm sure some are fine and some are not, you know.
Yes, exactly. And so in turn, I'm going to do these kind of separated. So for the Tucuxi, they were previously listed by the IUCN as data deficient. However, as of 2020, they were listed as endangered.
Oh, really? Wait,
so that
20,
is yep.
When? 15?
2020.
Oh, 2020.
Yep. So so a lot of the papers and stuff that I was looking at, a lot of the articles were referencing them as data deficient, but when I actually checked the IUCN website, they are currently listed as endangered as of last year.
And that's the Tucuxi?
That's the Tucuxi. And so again, like I said, we don't have actual population numbers. However, I was able to get estimates for a couple areas. So in Peru, they estimate there's around 350 dolphins. In the Amazon River, around 400 dolphins, 410 dolphins. So again, like Trevor already mentioned, they have these very discrete pockets of animals, which we'll talk a little bit about in the threats too, about why that might be an issue in terms of conservation. For the Guiana, they are currently, again, population size is unknown, and they are currently listed as near threatened by the IUCN.
So how do you get from data deficient to endangered when you don't have any population numbers?
Yeah, that's weird to me.
Yeah. I don't know, but that's why I double checked, because I was looking at something else and they were like, oh no, they're now listed as endangered. And yeah, sure enough, when you go on the IUCN website, they are under the red list as endangered as of last year. But
I wonder if they do that, like when in doubt.
Preemptively.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm just wondering if they do have estimate numbers for enough of their population areas, maybe they can kind of ballpark it and say, well, that means that there's likely a population of less than this amount, and they're in these very discrete. And the thing is, again, we'll get into this in threats, but where they live is under a lot of anthropogenic pressure. So
especially
again,
rivers not good.
Yeah. So I mean, again, just based on where they live, that might be again a preventative listing. But yeah, quite intriguing. And I did double check that because I was like, oh, that seems. But yeah, like I said, it's a very, very new listing as of last year. So hot off the presses. So with that, let's get into the threats. So as a lot of cetacean species that we've already talked about, both of these, the Tucuxi and the Giana, are prone to accidental bycatch. And apparently the Tucuxi is the most commonly bycaught cetacean in certain parts of its range, which is kind of sad. So gill nets and seine purseine fishing, is the most common. These are the most common problems for both species. And
again, gill nets also same problem for porpoises.
Yeah, I mean, just the nature of gill netting makes it a problem for almost all cetacean species. To be honest, just the way that it's done. True. The Guiana dolphins are also impacted by bottom set lobster nets, apparently as well. And there was a quote that I found on one website that was stating that in several areas of South America, literally hundreds of Guiana dolphins die every year due to bycatch. And in the Amazon Delta alone, they have about 2,000 Guiana dolphins every year that are bycaught.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, again, like
that's not sustainable.
No,
that's not sustainable, especially when we don't know the population numbers. It's kind of alarming.
Yeah.
So there has been some more recent research into the use of acoustic pingers, which are also known as seal scarers, but they can attach these to nets basically. And the idea is that they will deter the dolphins from entering the nets and therefore getting bycaught. So apparently they've had some success with that, but that's still kind of a work in progress, I guess.
Well, and when the last conference we went to, there was like a whole day practically on pingers and that they're, whether they work, whether they don't, I think one of them was like it was a seal scare, but it didn't scare the seals, but it scared the porpoises.
Yes. Yeah. And so a lot of these things, it does have to do with the frequency of pitch that they are, emitting and all that kind of thing. So there is at least some research going into how to address this issue, which is great. The next threat that we'll talk about is active hunting and or death from human interaction.
Right.
Apparently hunting them is not super common. Certainly not as common as certain other species that we've mentioned in the podcast. It's thought that one of the reasons that might be is that there are, as we talked about with the Amazon river dolphin, there are quite a lot of like myths and legends and cultural associations with river dolphins in general that have or may have prevented too much commercial exploitation of these, which is fantastic.
Which I think is so cool that a myth is protecting them. I love it.
Yeah, and so I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think that a lot of the cultural association is that river dolphins are actually the ancestors who have transformed into dolphin species. So it's basically like your ancestors watching you kind of thing.
I forget what, if there was one. I think it was with a seal, the selkie.
That's the
right?
selkie. Yeah. So that's a Scottish
version of that with porpoises, or not porpoises, but river dolphins. Like it's the same idea that they turn it, their ancestors.
They can shed their skin and turn into a dolphin. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So, however, they are, obviously they are taken for both their meat and their blubber in certain areas, particularly around parts of Brazil, apparently. The blubber, I guess, is mostly used as shark bait, which is kind of intriguing.
Still one thing to kill another thing.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, got to find bait for something, I guess.
Right.
So again, they're not exploited a ton in that respect, but they are killed intentionally still. And again, as Trevor alluded to in the introduction, one of the main issues around this is that most parts of their range don't provide protection for these species. And even though there are some parts that are protected by law, enforcement is almost impossible. I mean, especially when you're residing up these different river areas, it's very difficult to get to these. It's almost impossible for any kind of enforcement to prevent active hunting of these animals. So it becomes an issue of reach, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, enforcement, that's the problem with any fishing
Absolutely
thing.
Yeah,
enforcement is just so hard. It's a big, huge ocean.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, I mean, even when you're talking about these river areas, they're really difficult to get around, and you can only patrol so many.
Well, again, I mean, look at the Amazon River Basin. It's pretty large.
Yeah, hundreds and hundreds of miles.
Yeah.
So in terms of other ways that humans are impacting these guys, a big one is habitat destruction. So as I mentioned earlier, and kind of had you guys put a pin in, when we're talking about these very discrete populations that are segmented in different parts of rivers, any kind of habitat destruction or encroachment is a serious threat to those populations. And there's a ton of different ways that we are doing this, unfortunately. Obviously, just general habitat encroachment through building and farming around these areas. That then leads to a lot of pesticide runoff. There's still a lot of pesticides in use in those areas that have actually been banned, that are highly toxic, but they're still being used.
Yeah, I mean, things like DDT, are banned in many places, but in other places are still being used.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, even though they're banned, if that's all you have access to, that's still what you're going to use.
Yeah.
You're just
and it may not be banned there.
Maybe you'll get a fine. Well, I mean, and I think even some that have been legally banned, people are still using because that's what they have access to.
That's true. Yeah.
So it's a combination. Boat traffic, especially, on those coastal areas. So the Guyana might be a little bit more at risk from boat strikes, noise pollution from those boats, and from construction, which I'll get into next.
And the pingers.
And the pingers, potentially, right? Exactly.
That's another thing, like, right, you're putting that out, now you're just putting more noise pollution out to try to save them.
Yeah, absolutely. The introduction of marine culture farms, which is kind of a newish one, but that is becoming more and more of a hot thing to do out there. And then heavy metal toxins, also as a big pollutant. So I guess one of the examples given was mercury from gold mining, which is intriguing, but just the heavy metal pollution in these areas is substantial. And as we've talked about in many other podcasts, you get bioaccumulation up the food chain. These animals are storing these toxins and these pollutants in their fat stores, and metabolizing them when they are nutritionally stressed. So not great.
I think a good analogy to for the river part of why all this stuff is so much harder is the example of the Chinese river dolphin that went extinct, the Yangtze, that went extinct because of all of these things are all happening in the smaller area of the river versus open ocean.
exactly. You can't get away from it.
Things. So yeah, we really have to be careful because we've already lost a species. I think it's gone extinct.
And it is important, just on that note, to mention just the mixing that occurs in a river versus in the open ocean as well. So some of these things can be diluted somewhat if you're in the open ocean, and moved around, where again, yeah, like you said, it's basically just you're pouring these things into a very narrow space that doesn't have the ability to mix in the same way that the open ocean does.
And these animals are not going very far. They're staying in these small areas. So these small home ranges are also an issue.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
And then lastly, like I said, just dam construction is becoming more and more common in these riverine areas. Hydroelectric dams are a huge issue for these species, both of these species actually. So again, it increases the fragmentation of populations, which are already fragmented. And also a big one is that it alters and potentially reduces fish migrations and movement, potentially reduces the fish populations in those areas, which means less food for the dolphins in the areas that they actually live in. So it's not great for the dolphins.
I was laughing right at the beginning of that because I wasn't thinking that you were saying dam as in the dam that you're building, but that these damn things that which also goes, but
I mean, true.
I was like, oh wait, no, she's actually talking about dams. Okay, sorry.
Okay, so with all of those dire issues, we'll get into some fun facts. So we already talked about quite a few fun facts about these guys with their teeth and their brain size. But one of the things that's always really fun to do in this section is talk about where the names came from. So let's talk about Tucuxi first. So the common name Tucuxi comes from, and I apologize in advance, I'm probably going to butcher these names, comes from the Tucuxi Una, after the Tupi language of the Mayanas Indians in the Amazon region of Brazil. And so in that region, the Tucuxi are also known as the Boto Tucuxi, the Boto Cinza, or simply Boto.
Which is interesting because the pink Amazon River dolphins also known as Boto. So that's confusing.
I know, and I'm wondering if that's a kind of catch-all term almost.
It might be, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The Guiana is more named after the location, I believe. And in terms of the Latin name, Setalia is the genus. That has no known origin, apparently, which is very intriguing.
Everything has an origin.
Right. So Setalia, no known origin. However, for the Tucuxi, their species is the fluviatilis, and that means of a river, which is pretty cool.
Oh, right. So it's unknown of a river.
Yeah. And then the Guianensis is the newer species name for them once they determined that they were actually genetically two different species, hence the name Guyana. Another fun fact is in the Amazon, the genitals and eyes of the Tucuxi are sold as love charms.
So I thought that's interesting, and that they said that the myths protected them. But then they
also
said that
makes them desirable.
And I was like, wait a minute.
It makes sense though, right? It's like, and again, these might be two different cultures, right? So you could also be talking about, one culture values them, one culture values them in a different way.
Right.
And their teeth and bones are often used for crafts as well, which is, I guess, resourceful.
Play with some bones.
And then as you mentioned, Cindy, they are also very, very social. And so they have been observed playing with multiple other cetacean species, turtles, humans, dogs, like we already talked about. And then, the last fun fact that I had was just their eyesight, which again, we actually already talked about, that they do have pretty good eyesight, both above and below the water. Like you said, slightly less good than the Amazon River dolphin in the murky water, but just because of their, I think, especially when you live in a river, having good eyesight both above and below is really helpful, because you're not going to be spending the majority of the time with your head underwater. You're actually probably going to be in areas of low levels and lifting your head above the water too. Yeah,
especially during like low water season and everything. I thought it was interesting because they have like two areas of processing visual information versus only one in the Amazon River dolphin. And I don't know exactly the differences of what processing the visual information means versus the clarity of the vision. So, but they are better at processing it, but their vision isn't as clear. So
Interesting, which again,
Yeah.
maybe one's a trade-off versus having
Right.
clearer vision. You have the better ability to decipher the murkier image that you're seeing. Who knows?
Right. Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was all I had.
One more thing that I forgot to mention, and actually this might go back to when we were talking about being in the fast moving water, they avoid that, is that they're actually very slow swimmers compared to other dolphins. So even though they're really quick at the surface, you know, when they're surfacing and stuff, their, you know, longevity of swimming, I guess, is they're just not as fast. So that might be another reason why they avoid those high water and fast water moving areas, because they just can't swim through it.
Sure. Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah. So, and I guess maybe they don't need to be fast swimmers in where they live, in the rivers and stuff, which makes sense.
Yeah.
But, all right. Well, I think that's what I got. And that's it for the Tucuxi and the Giana, the Sotalia species. So hope you enjoyed that, a little bit more unknown species. And next time will be probably a journal review, right, Kat? I think so.
Yep. And I think we will be getting some more interviews lined up in January. So stay tuned for those. We have a few coming up.
Yeah, we're going to try to get them done in December, but then, you know, life and holidays and everything else, and sea turtles that show up in Washington.
Oh yeah.
That delayed our we were going to talk with a vet with a group around here, and we've had was it a green?
I think it was a green. Yeah,
a green sea turtle that got washed up here. And so they've been busy taking care of that animal. So, but yes, January is looking like January we'll have an interview or two to do. So that'll be exciting, something a little different. So as always, be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And if you want to know about any particular animal, throw it out to us over email or on social media. Tell us what you want to hear. And keep an eye on the Instagram stories for the poll of who to choose for the next marine mammal highlight. I think we might we only have one porpoise that we haven't done yet, so we might throw that one in the mix.
Oh, porpoise.
No porpoises. So with that, I think that'll do, and we will see you next time, or talk to you next time, I guess.
Bye.
Bye.
This was brought to you by Pacific Mammal Research, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. To learn more about the species we discuss, check out our blog. Head to our website, www.pacmam.org, that's PACMAM.org, to check it out. Also, help us continue providing fun and educational content like this by donating today. Your help is how we can continue to do our work and share it with you. Thanks.